Joel, this is your soapbox.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Joe. So hi, everyone. We have a lot of great things to demo today and plenty of risk involved with at least 4 different internet connections that have to behave and several live demos. So please bear with us as we go through this. And before you judge me for my plaid shirt, while it's still technically summer, it snowed in Denver last night. So you can go ahead and take back all your mean thoughts about my shirt. Great, and before we dive in today, we're going to just take a quick poll and just get a sense of where everyone's coming to this webinar from in terms of experience and what system you're on, etc. So the first question I have is, what is your level of experience setting up local development environments? Beginner, intermediate, or advanced? And no matter your experience level, we hope that you'll get something out of this webinar today. Great, moving on. What operating system are you using when you're doing local development?
Sorry, yeah. Joel, I'm trying to catch up with you here.
Yeah, no worries. If you want to throw the last one back up for people, that's fine.
So it looks like we're about half beginner and then the rest between intermediate and advanced. I see some maintainers on the thread, so I'm super thrilled about today. Right.
Cool, thanks, Joe. All right, and what operating system are you using for local development? Mac OS, Windows, Linux, or other? If you're using other, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. Today we'll be demoing on Mac OS, and a lot of the tools we're using are actually cross-platform. So cool. And looking at the results, it looks like a majority of folks are on Mac OS, but some other Windows and Linux users as well. Great. And lastly, if you're already doing local development, what are you using for that? Good old MAMP, Lando, DDEV, Drupal VM, Doxel. Curious what others are using as well.
We didn't put in a none just in our options, so there may be a few people out there that may not be responding. I'm going to just close the.
Cool. So looks like our clear winners are DDEV and Drupal VM, both of which will be demoed today. So very good. All right, let's dive right in. So feel free to ask questions as we go, and Joe, feel free to interrupt me with any questions. If not, we'll try and get to those at the end. We'll go ahead and share my screen here. All right, so quickly, let me just go ahead and give a quick pitch. Why is local development important? Some of you, of course, have the answer to this. If you've never done local dev, from my perspective, it allows developers to build confidence in a safe place to make mistakes. Right, we're able to make plenty of errors without affecting any sort of production environment. And it also allows us to improve our code quality by testing everything before it makes it to production. So I'm going to get things kicked off with Drupal VM and how to set that up for an existing Drupal project. Jordan Graham will do the same using DDEV, which is a Docker-based local development environment. And then Travis Tompkins will tie things up with a local development tool called Project X. And Project X is not trying to be its own tool like DDEV or Drupal VM. It's a CLI tool that helps to simplify and standardize the setup of these various tools. So I'm excited for him to be able to demo that today. All right, let's dive into Drupal VM. So as far as I know, Drupal VM was the first local development environment available specifically for Drupal. And someone, of course, will prove me wrong in the chat, and that's totally fine. Drupal VM is maintained by the legendary Jeff Geerling, who I think's on the webinar. And just a huge shout out and thanks to him for such a great product. It provides a Vagrant or Docker-based local development environment. And it's long been a staple of Aten developers because of its consistency and great performance, specifically on OS X, where we've had some issues with Docker's performance on OS X. I'm curious if others have seen that as well. All right, before I get much further, I just want to go ahead and assume some level of command line knowledge. If the command line is new to you, I definitely encourage you to take time to learn the basics so you can take advantage of some of the tools that we'll be demonstrating today. And again, I'll be demonstrating on Mac OS, but just know that Drupal VM supports Windows and Linux as well. All right, let's start at drupalvm.com. And I definitely encourage you to take a peek at the quick start guide. It covers all the bases in terms of what you need to install up front. I'm assuming that you've gone ahead and installed Vagrant and VirtualBox, as those are applications that can be installed just like anything on your machine. Ansible is also useful to install if you're using it, but not a requirement. Cool. And there are many ways to, well, let me back up a little bit. So after you install Vagrant and VirtualBox, next up, we'll want to go ahead and download the Drupal VM project. And just for a little bit of how I organize my local development environment is I typically drop all my projects in my sites directory in my home folder. For today, just to not show so much clutter, I've created a directory called Sites Webinar. And so I've created a webinar directory here, and I've cloned my Drupal repository. So this contains all my Drupal code. Drupal VM doesn't care where you put it really, but this is how I like to do it. Some people like to use one Drupal VM instance for all their projects, and others like myself like to do one Drupal VM instance per project. So if I really hose something, I'm only affecting one project at a time. All right, so next up, I'm going to download Drupal VM and drop it right here inside of Webinar. So there are various ways that you can get the Drupal VM project. You can download it just like I did. This is a really simple way to do it. You can clone it from GitHub. I'm simply just going to drag and drop it right into my webinar project directory. So now I have two directories, Drupal VM, so I'm going to rename it so it's a little simpler. And then I have my project repository with my Drupal code. Great. Now it's time that we Go into our Drupal VM directory. There's one file that's kind of required to make some tweaks here, especially since we're setting this up for an existing project. Drupal VM can install Drupal for you, and we're going to set it up for an existing project because I feel like that's where folks get tripped up most often. So I'm going to duplicate the default.config.yaml file and just rename it as config.yaml. Great. Now that I've done that, I'm going to switch to my text editor. I'm using Visual Studio Code here. And I'm going to open the Drupal VM directory and the config.yaml file. This config.yaml file may feel overwhelming the first time you go through this. So I'm going to focus on what I most frequently change. So if I don't mention something, then you can assume that it's safe to ignore in most situations. All right, so let's start with our Vagrant hostname. This is actually the URL that you'll access your site locally. So .test is a great top-level domain to use for that, since it won't get blocked. Just going to go ahead and call this webinar. I'm going to copy that because I'll use that several times throughout this file. I'm going to go ahead and change the Vagrant machine name to webinar as well. If you're running multiple instances of Drupal VM, the Vagrant machine name needs to be unique. As long as you only have one project running at a time, you don't have to change the Vagrant IP. If you want to run multiple instances at a time, you may want to go ahead and change that. All right, let's scroll on down. So I think early on when I started local development, I got tripped up often by the synced folders. I didn't quite understand how that worked. Basically what we're doing here is we're telling Drupal VM or Vagrant what folder from our local computer that we want to be available inside the virtual machine. So in our case, that's our Drupal project. And if you remember, I cloned that to a directory called repo. Again, you can put it wherever you like. This is just how I like to do it. And this local path is relative to this configuration file. So I'm going to do // which means to go up one level and into a directory called repo. So that will make my entire repository available to the virtual machine. And then for the destination, this is the path inside the virtual machine. So when we connect to the virtual machine, this is where you'll navigate to find your code. Often like to just change this to the same name of the project for consistency's sake. And we'll actually end up using this destination path again here in a bit. So I'll go ahead and copy that. So we're going to scroll on down. Okay, so I copied our destination directory above, and I typically make that the same as the Drupal Composer install directory. So if you're using Drupal 8 or Drupal 9 with a Composer strategy for development, this is important to do. So I make that exactly the same. I'm going to disable Composer from actually building my project. If we were allowing Drupal VM to create a project from scratch, we would leave that as true. And I'm not going to have it install the site for us again. All right, the Drupal core path. So you can see it uses a variable to reference what we set previously. And you can see that the core path references /web. In some cases, you may need to change this to, say, docroot if you're on Acquia. You can change your database credentials if you like, or just leave them the same. And we're almost done here. You can scroll on down and do a few more really useful things in here depending on your project. So the installed extras is awesome. So if you want Drupal console or Drush or Xdebug, you simply uncomment these items and they will get installed when we provision our virtual machine. Also, changing things like the PHP version, you can do that here. All right, we've saved our file and we are ready to provision now. So this is where the command line comes in. I'm starting from my home directory here. So I'm going to change directories, CD, into my sites webinar directory. So you'll see we have our two folders here. We have Drupal VM and we have our repo. We want to be inside of Drupal VM. And to provision our virtual machine, we simply need to type a command, vagrant up. The first time that runs, it will take 5 to 10 minutes, depending on connection and the speed of your computer and other factors. So rather than boring you with watching it run through that, we'll pull a famous cooking show trick and show you the completed version here. Okay, so from here, we could type vagrant up. I've already done that. I'm going to type a command called vagrant halt. Those two commands are essentially like turning on and off a computer. Remember, a virtual machine is simply that. Your computer is running a different computer, essentially. So when we type vagrant up, it's like hitting the power button. It takes just a minute after you've provisioned it. And after it spins up with the vagrant up command, you can hang out and do nothing, but likely you'll want to be able to run commands inside your virtual machine. And that's where a command called vagrant SSH comes in. This command opens up a terminal session to your virtual machine. And if you remember our destination path we set in our config.yaml file, and now we can see our Drupal files have been shared successfully into the virtual machine. And now we could do anything that you can do on a server within this environment. So if we want to be able to run Drush commands or import our database, we can do that. Since we're setting up an existing project, maybe this is the first time you've cloned the repository. I just want to note that you can run all your composer commands in here, which is quite nice. It's already installed. So we could run composer install here and make sure there's nothing to install. So in my case, there's nothing to install or update. And so we're ready to download our database from our hosting provider and import it. So I've gone ahead and downloaded the database. And it's important to just put it somewhere accessible in this project because it needs to be shared into the virtual machine. In this case, you can see my SQL file here. And now we can import that easily using Drush SQL C. I skipped one very important step. before Drush would be able to connect locally, we need to make sure that our local settings file is set up. So I'm going to open up my Drupal repository and go in the web and sites. And I made a copy of this example.settings.local.php file and put that into default. And this is how, when you're developing locally, you can tell Drupal where your database is. So one of the most important parts of this file is simply telling it where your database is. And in our case, I'm using the Drupal for the database username and password that was set up in the config.yaml file. And once that's done, Drush then has access to your database. So that's how we were able to run that command successfully. And if all that worked well, we'll be able to access our site through the web browser using the path that we had set up initially here, the vagrant host name. So let's go to our web browser and see if it loads how we expect. Perfect. So that worked as expected. And now you can do your local development just as if you were on a server somewhere. So we could log in using Drush ULI, for example. We could make configuration changes or test new modules and then release that code when we're ready. So that's it for Drupal VM. I'm going to hand things over to Jordan Graham to take us through setting up DDEV locally.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jordan Graham, and I'm a full stack developer with Aten Design Group. And today I'm going to talk about using DDEV for local Drupal web development. I am going to show you how to get a brand new site started using DDEV, but I'm also going to show you how to get up and running with an existing site. Say somebody said, here's your repository, here's a database, get cracking. I'll show you how to get cracking using DDEV. So I'll share my screen with you. And I've made available a couple of resources that I recommend to you. I'm putting the URL here in the chat. So the Dropbox document there. So I've got a couple of resources. The Read the Docs for DDEV is really helpful, and it's got information on stuff that I'm not going to be able to cover with you guys today. I also have a link here to Docker Desktop, which is the version, as Joel mentioned, DDEV is a Docker-based technology, and your Docker setup is going to be dependent on your operating system. So in the system requirements section of Read the Docs for DDEV, you can find out about what version of Docker you're going to need based on your operating system. So before I get really started, I want to show you just a quick word about ports. If you're like me, you might have different local environment setups running for different projects in your machine. In my machine, something else is listening on port 80. So that's a port that's commonly used to listen for internet connections, which means it's not available to DDEV for me on my machine. So I just mentioned this now. I'll show you in a moment where we make this change, but it's a super simple change to just set a different port for your machine to use to listen for connections for DDEV. So let's get started with setting up a new project using DDEV. So just like a cooking show, I've gone ahead and done these steps in advance so that you don't have to watch my computer do its work. But let's look at the different commands and talk about them a little. We create a directory in which your project will live, and then change directory into that. The DDEV config step is really where the fun gets started, and I've added a couple of parameters here. I added the project name parameter. It's not necessary to add this. If you don't, it'll use the name of the directory in which this project lives as the DDEV project name. But I point this out so that if you have like some big long directory name, your local dev URL can be made to be much shorter. You could say Drupal 9. So the project name doesn't have to be the same. So you can set that to what you'd like. I am saying that I'd like the project to be a Drupal 9 project. Drupal 8's available, Drupal 7, if I'm not mistaken, as is WordPress. And I was really surprised when I was looking at Read the Docs for DDEV at how many different sort of technologies and platforms it supports. So it's really robust that way. I'm specifying the doc root name. So, you know, if you are, so web is really common for some composer-based Drupal installations. If you're developing toward an Acquia hosting environment, Acquia likes to name their doc root, so that in your case might be -- doc root equals doc root. And lastly, I'm asking DDEV to go ahead and create that doc root. So that is step 3, and I've got this set up to take a look at that. I just want to show you what that looks like. So after you run that, that command, this is what our project looks like. So it did create the web directory, and as you can see, Drupal's not here. So let's see, that's fine. We do have sites default, and we've got settings, and we've got a DDEV settings directory as well. So that's what's in the web directory. Drush is basically empty, and in DDEV you've got you know, a little bit going on so far. And here's the config.yaml directory that file that I was talking about earlier. And let's look at that for a second. This is where I changed my router HTTP port. So when you execute that command, it'll default to 80 here. So I changed it to 8,000 to avoid that conflict with my other local environment. This would be a good place to change the PHP version if you're particular about that. And there's an awful lot in the config.yaml file. I can't get into all of it today. I do want to highlight one thing, and that is I set xdebug enable to false in my config YAML because there's a good toggle command to enable xdebug on the fly if you need to. So in other words, I keep it disabled most of the time, and if I need to enable it for some debugging, I can always toggle it on using a DDEV command. So that's what the project looks like so far. The next thing that the next bit of work we need to do needs to have our virtual machine running, our container running. So we'll use the command DDEV start. So I'm going to do that in my finished. This is the finished product. So I'm going to say DDEV start here and let that get started. So while that's working, let's go back and look at our next steps. We're going to create our Drupal project using Composer. So it'll be a Composer create command. And I am going to use the Drupal/recommended project just to make it easy for down the road for things like upgrading and updating. But I preface it with with DDEV so that everything that we are going to need inside our container from the Composer create command is going to be inside the container. So it makes DDEV aware of what's going on, and so that's why we preface it with DDEV. So this downloads Drupal, and it downloads all of Drupal's dependencies. It does like a Composer install and creates an artifact for us, which means we're basically have almost everything that we need. I do want a Composer require Drush, but I'm going to preface that with DDEV again because I want Drush to be available inside my container. So if you have Drush installed globally on your computer, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work inside your container. So this is why we want to make sure that Drush is inside the container. So that's everything that is necessary to get that started. I love DDEV launch because sometimes I forget what my local dev URL has been set to, and I don't have to remember that because DDEV does. So I just type in DDEV launch, and it says, Jordan, you called it finish-drupal9-site.ddev.site. And there we are. There's our brand new project that we just created using DDEV. It's that easy. While we're here, I'll show you, just as Joel showed for Drupal VM, the DDEV SSH command allows us to get into our machine, and there we have Drupal and so on. So this all looks very familiar, but that's how you can get inside to do your Drush ULIs and so on. And when you're done developing on this particular project, just a DDEV stop command will get you, it basically turns off the computer, as Joel was saying. So that's how you get started on a brand new project. Probably you'll need to get an existing project up and going. So this process is really similar, but I want to just highlight a couple of differences. So I'm assuming that you have cloned your repository down to your local, and you have a copy of the database, again, somewhere nice and close to where you're going to need it once your machine is up and running. So here is the site that I've cloned. So I've cloned my repository in here. Here's my existing project db.sql. So this looks really similar to what Joel was just showing us a second ago. So now we're in the directory, and we need to do our DDEV config command. So let's see if I can highlight this. Thank you, just like that. The thing to remember is we actually now have to be specific and use the actual doc root name. We see that it is web here, so it's that quick and easy. And if we look now at our code base, we see what we had a moment ago, but also now we've got the DDEV directory, and I'm going to go in and set my router HTTP port so that I don't have that conflict. So that's great. We're ready to roll, because the next thing we need to do is import our database. That has to happen while the machine is running. So I'm going to DDEV start. And so Joel just showed you one way to import your database, which would be to shell into your machine. So it's DDEV SSH, and then you can drush SQL C less than your database name. So you saw how to do that just a moment ago. DDEV also has a command that you can execute outside of the container. So that's in DDEV import DB, and what did I call it again? Existing project db.sql. If it's in a different directory, you're going to need to add the path as well, but mine is right where I need it. So it's just like that. And then we can DDEV launch. Again, I don't remember the URL, so look at that. Drupal.ddev.site. And here you can see we've got an existing site built with Drupal VM running on DDEV. So it's that easy to get up and going on an existing project using DDEV. So with that, I am going to DDEV stop and pass the webinar over to Travis Tomka.
All right, thank you, Jordan, for that. That was awesome. I'm Travis Tomka. I'm a backend developer here at Aten. I'm going to talk to you about Project X, and what Project X is a streamline, a way to streamline the local development process, among other things. But mainly, we're just going to touch on the development process. I'm currently the maintainer of Project X. It's something that I've been working on for a while here at Aten and on my personal time as well. So you're probably wondering, what is Project X? It's a pluggable CLI utility that can be connected or customized to work with various projects. It's built on top of the Robo framework, and such other tools that are built on top of there are Drush and Terminus and some other ones that are well known. Project X is mainly not trying to overtake or become a utility on which we compete with DDEV or anything like that. It's kind of making a agnostic overlay on top of that, where these commands get translated underneath. So I'm going to go ahead and show a diagram to probably articulate this a little bit better. We'll be sharing my screen. So this is the screen here is we're running a command. That command goes into the Project X CLI plugin environment adapter. This adapter essentially is understanding what environment you're running underneath for each project. So you could be running Lando for one, you could be running DDEV for another, you can have another one on Drupal VM. It doesn't really care. Project X will be handling that part of it and translating and transforming the commands that you write into the appropriate project. So, and then those are all on top of a Docker or VM solution. So that kind of articulates what Project X is doing. So let's go ahead and see this in action. So I'm going to switch over to my terminal here. I have a project already started, but the commands that I actually ran to get to this point are composer, create project, and then project / Project X / the Drupal recommended project. What this is doing is essentially doing what Drupal recommended projects already does. It's allowing the install of Drupal plus adding the benefits of Project X to it. So it's adding one plugin. The plugin would only be the Drupal Project X plugin. And those just provide additional commands on installing Drupal and working with Drupal frameworks. I'm not going to actually run that right here since I've already done it, just like all the other demos. We have the cooking show concept going. So I'm going to not run that. And if you were actually starting on an existing project as well, you can be able just to run a composer acquire Project X, and then you can just download the core PX binary, and you'll essentially be off and running in the same way. So you can do this on existing and off from a new start. I'm not going to run that command either. So just as if you would have ran those commands, now that you can run PX, you can now see we have a whole array of different commands that are available. So what I'm going to touch on here is there's one for install. So this one will show you all the plugins that are capable to be installed for Project X. So we'll just do install. And we can see that we have PX Drupal VM, we have one for Drupal, we have one for Pantheon, Jira, and DDEV. So we're supporting all the two frameworks that we're actually talking about now is Drupal VM and DDEV. So what you would have to do is just hit 0, and that would install Drupal VM, or hit 4 for DDEV. This will give you that capabilities of running those environments underneath the project. And then what this actually does is make all the commands that you're running agnostic. It doesn't really care that you're running DDEV. It's really running the commands for you underneath. So we have that set. Let's quickly look at my project here, and we're just looking at the composer file just to kind of show you, articulate here. We have added the PX libraries, the one for Drupal and the one for Drupal VM. So now that we have those added and everything's installed, now what we would have to do is configure those. So we're going to be just demoing the Drupal VM plugin this go around. So let's do config set, and it's going to ask us a couple of questions. What do you want to set up, the environment, or there's a Drupal plugin that we have configurations for. So we'll just do environment. It will outline all of the options that we have available. We can do local host or Drupal VM. I wanted to do Drupal VM. Perfect. Went ahead and it saved that configuration. Now what we have to do is I'm going to do that one more time, and I'm going to just set up Drupal real quick. The plugin just needs to know a little bit of information from Drupal, like the web root and stuff like that. And also knows what provider you're working with. It works right now with just Drush, but there's plans to get Drupal console support here shortly. So once we have everything's configured, now we can do PX env, so environment init. So there's an init function. Whenever you're starting a new environment, you want to init. This is just your setup phase. So what this is really going to be doing is it's going to provide us an interface to Drupal VM. Instead of going through the documentation and running these commands ourselves, we're just telling Project X what we want. So it's going to recommend what Drupal VM is recommending. It's 7.4. We can override that and say, no, we want to actually use 7.3 for this project. We want to name this to demo.test, and we can change to the machine name. Pretty much just like what Joel was showing us, is we're providing a UI for it and allowing the user to interface with that instead of having to go through the configurations, because configurations can sometimes lead you into trouble where you mistype something, or something didn't get added, or spacing or whatnot. So now we're just going to finish along here, and it's going to ask us for the plugins that we want to install for Vagrant. I'm just going to do these two. It will ask us if we want Drush, Xdebug, everything that we would have to uncomment or comment out in the configuration based on Joel's demo. This all provides you an interface so you can select whatever ones you want, or you can just kind of go along with the defaults that are all up here in the brackets. To do that, you just hit enter to accept any of the defaults. It will ask you the web root. We're just going to use web for this one. It's going to go ahead and write those configurations. So the configurations files that it wrote were the config.yaml file and the vagrant file. The way that this instance is working is Joel showed you a different approach where the project is outside of this. We're actually using the Composer Drupal VM solution, and this is bringing in all the configuration, all the Drupal VM files into the project using Composer. So now that we've done that, we can provision the environment. I'm not going to provision it right now just because it's a little time consuming. So we're going to go ahead and hit no. So we can pretend that the provision actually went through, and I'm going to just do an environment up or a start. And this is actually, you can see right here, we're just running the vagrant up commands. You're not having to remember the commands. You're kind of remembering the Project X commands, and doesn't matter if you're running the Docker or DDEV or Drupal VM underneath, is always going to run the appropriate commands for you. So this will load up, and hopefully we'll be done here shortly. After this is done, we're going to be showing you how we can get Drupal up running pretty fast. We have a lot of cool approaches to this same type of interface, on which will allow us to quickly install without touching a line of code. You see that I haven't switched to my editor at least once, other than showing for composer.json. So it's going to ask us if we want to bring up the environment or launch the environment, just pretty much like how DDEV did it, where we're doing a DDEV launch. Project X has this, and it works with all of the platforms. So we're going to hit no, because we don't actually have Drupal yet set up. So now that we're working on getting Drupal set up, our environment's actually up and running. So that's pretty cool. So what we have to do is we're going to do Drupal install. And what Drupal install will do is ask us more questions, like how do you want to store the salt hash outside the web root? That's really the recommended approach, just because of security concerns. So we're going to go, of course. And then there's also like storing configurations outside the project root. This is another common practice that a lot of developers do and a lot of projects support. So we go ahead and hit yes. Disabling the installing and updating of modules from the UI. We don't really like our clients to ever be able to add or update modules through the UI. We'd like to handle that through Composer. So we always usually just disable that. So we're going to hit yes. So it goes through a couple of the common things that we face every day. These can change per project, and we will probably be adding more as they come about. So now that we can see down here, we wrote two files, one for the settings.php settings.php and one's for the settings.local.php. I'm going to go ahead and circle back to those as the project is being installed so that we can utilize the time. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a demo project. And I'm going to take the default for the site mail and for the account information. Now that we have this running, all you can see is we're essentially Vagrant SSHing into the environment and running a drush command to install the site. That's all Project X is really doing, is it's transforming these commands that we're writing into to the appropriate environment commands. So we're going to go ahead and hit yes. And now that this looks like it's starting good, starting Drupal install, this might take a while. Perfect. Let's switch over to the editor that I have here, and I'm going to just reload from this so I get the most recent changes. And if we go to here, we're going to see that we have our settings.local file and settings.php file. These weren't here before, but you can see now it just essentially Project X built these and filled these out for us. It knows about the database credentials, so it will automatically populate this information for us. And it also knows about what settings, like how to handle adding the salt, how to add the configuration sync directory, and then the authorization of being able to upload and save modules from the UI. So both those files are written for us, so we don't have to actually touch them. So now if we just circle back and look at our terminal, we should now see that Drupal is becoming farther along in the process of the installation. It should just be another 30 seconds, hopefully less. Here we go. I think we're coming up on the final seconds. All right, it says Drupal was installed successfully. Do you want to launch the application? Of course I do. So it just goes ahead and it will open up the project for us. And if we did everything correctly, we should now see a site here. So there we go. Welcome to the demo project. That's exactly what we needed. We got spun up with Drupal really fast. Just to kind of recap on some things, let's go back and see what other things we can do with Project X. Like a lot of the common commands that we saw with Joel's demo is being able to SSH into the environment and to run drush and all these other cool things. So we can do that. The nice thing about it is we don't have to SSH into it. There's Project X offers a way to use Drupal or the Drupal plugin. And all we have to do is, since we set it up in the configuration saying that we were using the drush provider, it now knows that we're using drush to execute all of our commands inside the environment. So when we run px Drupal, Drupal is such an alias. The real command is Drupal execute, but you don't have to write the execute. You can just write Drupal, and you can then now write any arbitrary command that drush would accept, and it will now proxy that through to the environment for you. So there's no having to SSH into the environment. To run these commands, you kind of stay in one area of the application, and that's usually on your local. You can kind of move freely. You're a little bit easier than if you're inside of a container. You can forget you're inside that container and run commands thinking that you're on your actual host. So that's a nice feature that we offer here. And then another one that's really cool is being able to save projects as a bookmark. So because like us here at Aten, we work on a variety of projects. So we have to switch between projects pretty much every day or every couple hours we're switching. So we built in a switch command. And this switch command will allow us to switch to projects, other projects that have been set up with Project X. It doesn't matter if you're running DDEV or Drupal VM underneath it, everything will work exactly the same. So the way to do that, if we just go ahead and look at what's available, we have a core save command here. This will save the project location information for us, and then that will allow us to be able to switch between the projects. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and do px core save, and then we would input the name test, and now we've added this to our projects. Now we can switch to another project, and I can do switch, and from here we can switch to, let's do NPL, which is another project that I'm working on. It's going to ask me if I want to stop the project. I'm going to go ahead and stop that project. And what it does here is, you can see it says this command was copied into your clipboard. So I don't even have to copy it. It copies this command into my clipboard. So all I have to do is now run that command. It will CD me into that project and run the environment up command for me, which will start up my project so that I can continue working on something new. To kind of sum everything up, I'm going to just circle back to the Project X project. So you can see these are where we're hosting all of our projects on GitHub. We are happily accepting pull requests or patches or enhancements or questions, feedback, whatever you can want to post in the issue queue here. This is the one that I use to start the Drupal recommended project. To start up a project, you can look at the code there on which I'm using. And that's about it. I'm gonna hand it back to Joe for Q&A.
Yeah, hey, so we are almost at the top of the hour here. I think we have time for just one question before I close. I'm just gonna pick one of the questions that came in, and then we'll follow up with any other questions via email afterward. I just want to be very mindful of the time. The question was, what's the value of having this kind of environment? Setting up a specific development environment, and not just installing Drupal on your local machine. Joel, do you want to take that? Okay, Joel, you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. Could you clarify a little bit, Joe? Is the question like what setting up a local environment per project, or just like a general playground?
Yeah, why not just, when I was a developer, I used to just install PHP in MySQL and build my own environment. Why use a project like this?
Yeah, so I think one advantage of if you work on a team of developers, or even by yourself and you're working on multiple projects, like I was saying, if you set up one instance per project, you limit sort of your fallout if something goes wrong. If you're working on, say, a variety of different projects, Drupal 7, Drupal 8, WordPress, you can do things like have different PHP versions per project. Or, if you're working on a more complex project that requires something like Apache Solr, you can turn that on per project and not have to, bog down your machine by creating one monolith, like local dev environment. And then
Awesome.
You can also do things like share that configuration with other developers on the project. So you're both working with a very similar local dev environment.
Oh, that's awesome.